We're in our Revelation study, and we were studying the chapter 3, the latter part there, the church at Laodicea, and we were looking at some slides of some of the ruins of Laodicea, and our time expired in the midst of that, so we'll go ahead and continue. We have a few more of these slides to show, and this is very interesting here because this is an aqueduct piece. You remember we commented that Laodicea had bad water. The water just wasn't a good quality, and many people think that the interpretation there where Jesus says you're lukewarm and neither cold nor hot had reference to their water, that they would be able to identify with that because they lived between Hierapolis, which was just about 6 miles to the north, and then to the south, I forget the name of that, Colossae to the south, about 10 or 11 miles. And Colossae had good cold water. Hierapolis had hot water, which was used for medicine. And people would bathe in it, and it was supposed to be good for the health. But Laodicea had to pipe their water in through aqueducts. And by the time it got to Laodicea, it was a real bad quality. And we'll see that here. Here's an aqueduct piece. Now, the way they would make some of these aqueducts is they would hew out stones and put this hole in it and then make it so it would fit a stone sitting right next to it, and these would pipe water into the city. And you can imagine what a large amount of labor would be involved in doing that. That's a different look at that aqueduct piece, and here are quite a few of them strewn about. And to form the aqueduct, those would be placed side by side, and it would form that pipe, and the water would be piped in through that aqueduct. Now here is an aqueduct, a portion of it, where these stones are placed side by side, and you can see how in the middle that pipe would be formed and that water would come in. And it was about 6 or 7 miles that they brought this water into Laodicea with the aqueducts like this. Now here's a double aqueduct piece, and this would happen when they would branch the line off to go to different directions once it got to the city. And you can see that one of these holes is smaller than the other. And that would be, of course, that branch would carry less water, would demand less water. And so I just can't get over the amount of work involved in this. And this here is called the water terminal. Now this water would come in and it would be up, and then they would give it pressure by coming down here, and you can see these pipes here. Thank you. Here's some pipes here coming down out of this terminal. There's one pipe, another row, another one here, one over here. So this water, once it got up here, would be filtered down through these pipes, and these pipes would go in different directions to be sent to different parts of the city. And this would be their water system. Now you can see this pipe here as a close-up. Look at the calcium buildup inside the pipe, and the hole is down to where it's only look like about 1 inch or 2 wide, whereas when they first put this thing in, they had this big, probably a 10-inch pipe, and the buildup of the calcium deposits through the years have filled that pipe, and we'll see that more evidence of that. There's a little picture of another pipe. Now the outside pipe would be, you can see parts of it here. And this calcium buildup is on the inside of this pipe, and you can see how restricted the water flow would be. Here's another view of a different pipe with the buildup of the calcium and the restriction. So I would imagine after some years that some people are not getting very much water through this. Now here's one that doesn't have quite that much buildup, but these are various pipes that archaeologists have found, and it shows us a little bit about the water supply at Laodicea, and we know that it wasn't good. So it could be that one of the interpretations there was that their water was of such poor quality. Jesus says, I wish it were either cold or hot, because if it was cold, it would be useful for refreshment and drinking and so forth. Hot, it would be useful for bathing and different things, but being lukewarm, it's really not useful for, and especially to be lukewarm and tepid. They say it actually made people, it was nauseous, it would make them sick. Here's a South bathhouse. Now, Laodicea was a large city, very wealthy. You remember, it was a banking center, and they had bathhouses throughout the city. Here's a part of the bathhouse complex, and you can see some of the work that went into this. Now, this is a stadium in Laodicea, and this particular, you can see here, this is where they would run their races, and this was one stadium in length. Now, stadium was a Roman measurement, or Greek measurement, and it came into Rome, and it was just over 200 yards. So the length of this stadium would be just over 600 feet. And of course, the people who would race, take part in the races, would run either the full length or run half the length or whatever the race was. But that would be where they would have their complex, and this is some of the seating on the side of the stadium. We'll have a little bit closer look up at some of that. Here's another picture of the stadium with the seating on the side over here. Now these are a closer shot of some of the seats. Of course, these here are hundreds of years old, so you can see how they've been worn down with time. And this particular seat, somebody inscribed something on it. We don't know for sure what that is. We do know that that was the start of the symbol for Christians. But I don't know if people were going to do that, because in order to be the complete symbol, it would have to have a mark down this way and one across this way, and that was the secret mark for Christians. Of course, somebody could have begun to make that and ran out of time, or something happened that they didn't get to finish it, but otherwise I don't know what that mark would be. But somebody was putting a mark on that seat. So the last verse in chapter 3 says, He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to the churches. We've discussed most of this verse, but I did want to point out a few things that normally it's thought that John is finished with his message to the churches at this point, because chapters 2 and 3 spoke specifically to the 7 churches to whom he wrote. And a lot of times people have the idea that once he finished chapter 3, what he had to say to the churches was complete, but that's not true. In fact, we'll find that chapter 4 picks up where chapter 3 left off and goes right on as a continuation. And keeping with verse 1, chapter 1:4 and 22:16, we can see that all that follows chapter 3 is also intended for the 7 churches, because in 22:16 the Lord actually makes the statement. He says, I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things for the churches. Now, chapter 22 is the last chapter in the book. So what Jesus is talking about here is everything that John has witnessed to, testified to, down through chapter 22 is for the churches. Which churches? These 7 churches to whom John wrote. He wrote chapters 2 and 3. Now, he addressed a letter specifically to each church. But we made the comment over and over again because he closed out each one of those 7 letters with, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to the churches. So John chapter 4 verse 1 indicates that what follows, chapter 3, what follows is a part of a series of events that had already begun. It's just a continuation. Just like you pick up a book and you read chapters. Of course, John didn't divide his book up into chapters and verses. This was done in about 1500, and it was done to help us in our Bible study. Because you say Revelation 22:10, you can find it a lot easier than you could have found it if somebody says, well, John said somewhere in Revelation, then you've got to go try to find where John said that. So it facilitates Bible study, but when John wrote the book, he didn't divide it up. He just wrote one scroll, and he wrote all capital letters, and no spaces in between the words. And you can imagine how difficult it'd be to read that, but thank the good Lord, scholars have educated themselves and learned how to decipher that and to read it and to translate it. So what follows then in chapter 4 is a part of the whole, and it continues right on. Any comment on chapter 3? Nope. Okay, Bonnie?
That's right. I think it makes sense about the lukewarm and hot referring to the water, because normally in any of the parables, usually something was picked that was familiar to the people.
Exactly.
So it makes sense to me anyway.
Bonnie seems to think that the interpretation about the quality of the water is probably correct, and it certainly may be. And another thing that kind of gives a little bit more evidence to what Bonnie said there is if hot and cold was ever applied to religious fervor in New Testament times, I don't know where it is except there in Revelation. It's the only point that I've ever come across where hot and cold could be applied to the fervor, religious fervor, or lack of it. So I'm kind of inclined to go along with the idea that the quality of water there is what Jesus was using to teach a lesson, like in a parable that he often used. Any other comment? Okay, let's go on then to chapter 4. Okay, this chapter is a good way to remember it is just to think of the throne scene, because it's only 11 verses, but the entire chapter is about the throne scene that John sees in heaven. And we're never told anywhere in this chapter who the throne occupant is, but it's easy to figure out that he's God by what's said about him. And we'll see that as we go through the chapter. So, chapter 4, the throne scene, and we have an introduction to this because a division at this point is a pretty natural thing. Because in chapter 1, John gave the background of the book. He told about him being assigned this task of writing to the 7 churches, and he's described Christ in the midst of the lampstands and told who who the lampstands, that they were the seven churches and so forth. So chapter 1 is a background that helps us to understand the entire book. And in chapters 2 and 3, he gets right into the job of writing to the seven churches that he was told to write to in chapter 1. So chapters 2 and 3 shows him carrying out that order. And here in chapter 4, it's a new segment of the prophecy, but this is indicated by the way chapter 4 starts off, because John says, after these things I saw. After what things? The things he had described in chapters 1, 2, and 3. So we see it's a sequence of events that's put out in chronological order, and we know that what he's going to describe in chapter 4, he saw after what he saw in chapter 1, 2, and 3. So it's a sequential type thing, and it helps us in our study. So it's a natural division at this point. Chapter 1 stated the background, chapters 2 and 3, the letters to the seven churches, and after chapter 3, chapter 4 seems to be a continuation. And chapter 22, verse 16 proves this, because there Jesus says, I have sent mine angel to testify these things for the churches. So this shows that chapter 4 is a part of, from what happens from chapter 4 through 22, is a part of the whole book. It's all to be taken as one book. So after these things indicates this continuation. So let's look then at this chapter. And all 11 verses is about the same theme. It's the scene that John is shown in heaven. In verse 1, he says, after these things I saw, and behold, a door opened in heaven. And the first voice that I heard, a voice as of a trumpet, speaking with me, one saying, come up hither, and I will show thee the things which must come to pass hereafter. Now, the English Standard Version gives a little bit more accurate interpretation of this door here, because it says a door standing open, whereas the American Standard Version says a door opened, and the King James says a door was opened. Well, the English Standard, a door standing open, gives us a little bit more clearer idea of what John saw, but it's not as clear as the Greek. In the Greek, it's a participle. It's a perfect tense verb. It says a door having been opened. The door had already been opened when John saw it. The door was opened sometime in the past. It was opened when John saw it, and so it was a having been opened door when he saw it. He didn't see it open. He didn't see it closed and then opened. He saw it was already open when he saw it. So I think this is pretty important, because it tells us a little bit about the scene that John is going to be shown is one that God had planned, and he had made this open door available so that we could understand how John could see it. Now, John tells us here how he was able to see this scene. Because he says, the voice which I heard at first. Now this goes back to chapter 1, verse 1, because there's where he heard the voice of the angel. God gave what he was going to be revealed to the angel to show John. And in verse 10, he hears this voice as a trumpet. It's symbolic here of its ability to be understood. So a trumpet would be shrill and plain, and this voice would be unmistakable in that it could be understood. certainly God would not give us a revelation and expect us to understand it if it could not be understood. And one of the main things that's necessary in order to understand anything is to be able to hear it. If I take these hearing aids out and you talk to me in a normal voice, I won't hear you. There won't be any communication because I won't hear what you're saying. So we have to hear, and this symbolism involved in this trumpet is that what God says can be heard. It's intelligible. It can be understood. And John is given a command here. This is not a suggestion. He says, come up here. It's a command. And so John doesn't have any choice about this. It's something that he is going to have to obey if he obeys God, because it's a command that God gives. So God wanted John up there where he could see what he was going to be shown. And so since the door in heaven had already been opened, then it's easy for us to understand how he went into heaven. He went in through this open door. Now, if he hadn't told us that he had seen a door having been opened, then we wouldn't really understand how he got there, how he got into heaven. But with this door having been opened, we see the access, the way to where John is going to see this throne scene was available to him. He went through that open door. Any comment on verse 1? Okay, look at verse 2 then. He says, and straightway I was in the Spirit, and behold, there was a throne set in heaven, and one sitting upon the throne. Now, straightway lets us know that this was an immediate thing. Immediately, when John heard the command, come up here, immediately he was in the Spirit. Now, this is the second time John has been under the control of the Holy Spirit. This happened in chapter 1 and verse 10 when he was in the Spirit. He says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Well, that just simply means he was under the control of the Spirit on the Lord's day. Well, here, after John was given this command, immediately he was in the Spirit again. He was under the control of the Holy Spirit, and we can understand how he got through that door, because the Holy Spirit ushered him in to the presence of this throne. And he says, and behold, there was a throne set in heaven. Now, this throne being set is one that had already been set again. In the Greek, it's having been set. So this conveys the idea that there was some process that had to be gone through in order to set the throne. The throne wasn't just placed there. There was some struggle involved in setting it. The action took place in past time. Having been set lets us know that this process of setting the throne was something that had already been done. John didn't see that action. This action took place before John saw this throne, so it was a process involved in setting it. And we'll study a little bit in chapter 12 about some of the things that were necessary to set this throne. You remember in chapter 12, we're going to study there the war that John saw in heaven. He saw a war between Michael and his angels and the devil and his angels. And of course, the outcome of that war was that Satan and his angels were cast out of heaven. Now, what does this indicate? It indicates that once he was put out, the obstacles to God's rule in heaven were solved. There was no more obstacles in heaven. But where was he put out to? The earth. So he comes down to the earth because he's cast out of heaven with all of his opposition and all of his slander and all of his accusations and all of the problems that he's going to cause, and he's busy doing that now because this is his sphere of operations now. Whereas before he could operate in heaven and earth. You remember back in Job when the sons of God came to present themselves before God? Who also came with them? Satan. Satan came with them. And Satan carried on a conversation with God. And he accused God of protecting Job. God says, no, he would serve me even if I didn't protect him. Satan says, no. Now you withdraw your protection and you watch him. He'll curse you to your face. Well, this is Satan arguing with God. The accusations he makes against God's omniscience. God knew all things. He knew Job would not curse him. But to prove it, not just to Satan, but to us, because we've got this story. We know that God was right. We know that Satan was wrong. But yet we know that Satan had the audacity to argue with God. And he's a created being. Of course, we see human beings arguing with God, don't we? Today, I mean, they spit in his face. So this is the degree to which Satan has got his hooks into people, deceive them, so that they join him in this fight. So we'll study more about this process of setting this throne. And we're given a little bit of insight into it. And I thought I had it on the overhead in Daniel. In Daniel chapter 7, I'll read you verse 9 there. Verse 9 says, Daniel saw a dream, and he says, I beheld till the thrones, plural, were cast down. So Daniel sees this dream where there were thrones, and these thrones were cast down. That means they were overcome. They were overpowered. They were conquered. They were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit. Now, the Ancient of Days didn't sit until these thrones were cast down. He went through this process of overcoming this opposition and cast these thrones down, and then he sit. And Daniel describes him. He says, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. So Daniel describes a little bit about this process here that had to take place in order for this throne to have been set when John sees it. So John sees here the throne occupant ruling. That's what one does when he sits on his throne. He rules. And so he sees this. John is a witness to this. And, well, there it is, Daniel 7:9. We just went through that. But so this throne occupant, we're going to be told more about him in just a moment. But we just know that now he's sitting, he's ruling. One sitting upon the throne. Any comment on verse 2? Harold?
This is back in verse 1, the last part of it. It says, come up here and I will show you what must take place after these things. What things is he talking about?
Okay, that's the same things that he was talking about in chapter 1 when he says, I'm going to show you things that must shortly come to pass. Well, he started showing him. He showed him some things in chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. But after those, he's going to see some more. He's going to continue to see more, which we go on through chapter 22. So our whole study in the book of Revelation is what was to come to pass quickly until we get to chapter 20, about verse 11, when we go into eternity. And but we'll see that when we get there. Bertha?
When he says he's in the spirit, does that mean that his spirit went up and saw this, but his body did not? Or does?
Where are you talking about?
On the second verse, when he said he was in the spirit.
No, I was in the Spirit. No, he was under the control of the Holy Spirit.
Okay, in the same sense of in the beginning.
Exactly.
So
And
his body he could have gone up bodily.
no, he went up. It was a spiritual thing, like the Apostle Paul, when he was caught up into the third heaven.
That's what
He said he didn't know. He says, whether in the body, out of body, I don't know.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what it means, Bertha. I wouldn't be positive on that. I wouldn't say that God couldn't transport somebody's body to heaven. He could if he wanted to, but we know that the kingdom of heaven is not flesh and blood. It's a spiritual thing. Okay, any other comment or question? Okay, let's look then at verse 3. And he says, and he that sat was to look upon like a jasper stone. Now, so he's talking about the throne occupant here. And a sardis, and there was a rainbow round about the throne like an emerald to look upon. So this description here is of the attributes of the throne occupant. We know that a spirit does not have flesh and bone. Jesus said that in Luke 24:39. We know that in John 4:24, Jesus walked through locked doors. He got into the room where the disciples were, and the door was locked. But he just went through the walls or through the door or somehow. And we can't understand how this could happen if he did this bodily. But once he got in, it was his body that was in there, because he told Thomas to come and put your hand where? Into my hand, into my side. He says, and be not unbelieving, but believing. So, but Jesus did these things miraculously, and this was after his resurrection. So John here is describing attributes of this throne occupant. So these attributes is that the jasper stone is probably the diamond stone. Now, jasper today is not a diamond. The meaning of the jasper has changed between the time when John wrote this and today. Today, jasper is not a precious stone, and it's abundant, and it's certainly not clear. But the description of this jasper stone is, in fact, the jasper is used again in Revelation 21:11, and there it says, having the glory of God, her light was like unto a stone most precious, as it were a jasper stone, clear as crystal. Now, what stone, what precious stone do we know of that's clear as crystal? The diamond. It's the only one that we know of that fits that description. So probably this jasper stone here that John sees, he sees this throne occupant as clear as crystal. No flaw in him, nothing to contaminate him, no blemish, no spot. And this is the way we think of God, as being pure and holy. And of course, John's using these to describe his attributes. This represented God's purity, his holiness, and his righteousness. I don't know so much about his righteousness, because righteousness deals with not only reward but punishment. We'll get to that in just a moment. Now, he says in the sardis is a red stone, probably representing God's justice. Why do we think of red when we think of justice? What is there about justice that makes us think of red, Barbara?
It was the blood, the Christ's blood.
Yeah,
Christ's
blood.
Took away everything and
Yeah.
made it yours.
Normally, when you think of justice, you think of punishment, and the ultimate punishment is death, isn't it? The shedding of blood. And so this stone, sardis, being red, probably represents God's justice, and this is one aspect of God's character that people don't like to think about. They don't like to think about God executing justice, because when he does, not only are people going to be rewarded, but people are going to be what?
Condemned.
They're going to be condemned. I mean, it's not just to reward the righteous. The guilty have to be punished. And this is one thing that's wrong with our society today, is the guilty is not being punished. In fact, many times they're being rewarded, because there are people out on the street that'll commit a crime just to go get 3 squares a day and have access to a library and to TV and to a gym and all this. I mean, they live better in prison than they do on the street. That's not justice. But, that's the way society's becoming warped, because Satan is turning things upside down. And this is what his goal is to destroy, and that's what he wants to do. So this red probably represents God's justice. And what do you think the rainbow is going to represent? Barbara?
The rainbow was his promise that he would never destroy the earth completely like he did before.
Exactly. It was a covenant that he made with all flesh, even the animals, all flesh, that he would never destroy all flesh again with the flood of waters. So it was, why do you suppose God made this covenant? Did he have to? No. Why did he do it?
Our peace.
His mercy. Yeah, his mercy. I mean, it broke God's heart to destroy these people. It broke his heart to destroy all the animals that he did. In fact, he told Jonah, when Jonah was sent to Nineveh, he says, should I not have, he says, if you felt sorry for that vine which you didn't plant, he says, shouldn't I feel sorry for all these people that don't know the right hand from the left, and the animals? You see, God cares about animals. He made them, and he cares about them. Of course, he tells us that we're worth more than many birds. And, of course, man is God's highest creation of the intelligent being. We're made in his image. The animals are not. But anyway, this rainbow would represent God's mercy. The covenant that he made with all flesh proves this. His mercy towards all of evil mankind. He doesn't have to be merciful to those that are not in a pathetic condition. Mercy is that attribute that if one has it, he feels merciful towards someone who is in a pitiful shape. If he's not in a pitiful shape, then there's no need for mercy. But it's when someone is in a very bad way that he's in need of mercy. And of course, mankind, being sinful, is in need of God's mercy. And of course, God is merciful. Any comment on verse 3? All right, let's look at verse 4. And he says, round about the throne were 24 thrones, and upon the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, arrayed in white garments, and on their heads crowns of gold. So John sees 24 elders sitting on 24 thrones. Now, the symbolism involved here is in the number 24, because it's used twice there, 24 elders on 24 thrones. So if we can understand these symbols, we get the message. If we don't understand the symbols, we don't get the message. The message in 24 seems to be that of organized religion, because it's used, 12 is used in the Old Testament and the New Testament in this way of being organized religion. Genesis 17 and verse 20, Ishmael was to have 12 princes. In 35:22, Jacob had 12 sons. In 49 and verse 28, these sons became the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then in Exodus 24 and verse 4, there were 12 pillars that Moses made when he was having the law there. And in Luke 2 and verse 42, Jesus was 12 years old when he went to Jerusalem to worship. And in Luke 9:17, I don't think I put that there, 12 baskets of fragments were gathered together after he fed 5,000 people, one basket for each apostle. So how many apostles were there? 12. 12 baskets. He told them, he says, gather up the basket. You can just see the apostles going and getting them a basket and starting to gather it up, and all of them got a full basket full, which shows us that, Jesus didn't want anything wasted, and he wanted all 12 of the apostles being busy. He didn't just have, 8 or 10 of them standing around watching the other 1 or 2 gather up basketfuls. They all got busy on this, and we can see that. So we can see how 12 becomes symbolic of organization in religious things. Now, 24 is a multiple of 12. So it represents both organized religion in the Old Testament and organized religion in the New Testament. You put them together, we got 24, and so this would be organized religion under both covenants. And I think this would be the symbolism here, because if this is true, then these elders, there were 24 of them, they would represent who? All of God's people in the Old and the New Testament. Now, where were these elders sitting? Sitting on thrones. And what do you do when you sit on a throne? You rule. So these elders, who represented probably all the saved of both covenants, were sitting on thrones ruling, victorious. And this is a wonderful thing. They had white garments, which indicated their purity, and it indicated the victory they had attained. They had a crown of gold, which would represent not only their royalty, but the victory that they attained in overcoming. This crown here is the Stephanos crown. There was the diadem and the Stephanos. The Stephanos was that little garland that the Olympic athletes were crowned with when they won. When they crossed the finish line victorious, they were given the Stephanos crown, indicating their victory. And these Roman Christians would understand immediately what was meant here, because they could see this as they read through this, because they knew the Old Testament teachings and they could understand it. Whereas the Romans, the pagans, would read this and it didn't mean a thing to them. Oh, they'd know what a Stephanos crown was. But, what about 24 elders sitting on 24 thrones with golden crowns? They wouldn't know what that meant, but the Christians would. They could understand it. And with the Christians understanding this message, what do you suppose this understanding is giving them? in their spiritual determination to live a Christian life. It's giving them courage, anyhow. It's making them strong, and this is what they're going to need because of these persecutions they were going to be facing, the hardships and tribulation. They needed this strength. They needed to know that these crowns were waiting for them, and that they were going to be recipients of it. Any comment on verse 4? Okay, they being 24 would represent the saved of both covenants. Now, we're going to run into this number 12 and 24 and again, but let's come back to this meaning and let's remember this meaning so that we don't have to, that we'll get the message, in other words. And if we can remember that, it'll give us that message. All right, verse 5, and out of the throne proceeded lightnings and voices and thunders, and there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which were the 7 spirits of God. Now, where did these lightnings and thunders and voices come from? They came from the throne. Okay, what would be the significance in their coming out of the throne?
That was who was ruling, that was who was controlling all.
Yeah, exactly. The throne occupant, whoever he is sending these things forth. Now, these lightnings that are coming out of the throne would probably be significant of the readiness and capability of God to carry out whatever needs to be done. You know, it's like a lightning strike. It's just instantaneous. It just happens. And I was standing on the porch one day, and I'm just standing looking in a rainstorm, and lightning hit a tree about 50 yards in front of me, and I went to my knees. I mean, it scared the fire out of me, and that tree smoked. It just happened, just quick as lightning. And we have that phrase, you know, that it indicates it can hit anywhere with power, and it means something. And of course, God's lightnings going forth, coming out of the throne, he has not only the power to send it, but to direct where it goes and what it hits and what it does. So this is kind of symbolic of God's capacity to take action. I mean, he can take action quick, and it can do exactly what he wants done. And these voices would probably be symbolic of the degree of control that he has on where that lightning goes and what it does. You know, God's voice did what in Genesis 1? God said. Yeah, God said, and things happened, didn't they? When he said. So when God speaks, things happen. And of course, these voices that John hears probably are symbolic of his ability not only to send this lightning, but to control what it does. And then the thunders, what do you think that would represent? Thunders. I think it'd be the power, don't you, and the ability to be heard. You hear thunder. You hear thunder, and it tells you some things, and you can hear it for a long ways off. In fact, it'll just rolling thunder. And so this would be symbolic of God's message that is capable of being heard. God's not going to speak unless he has some reason to speak, and when he speaks, he wants it to be able to be understood and for people to know why he speaks. And I think that's really the significance of what his word is. These 7 lamps that he saw here are indicative of the 7 spirits that we saw in chapter 1, which are symbolic of the one Holy Spirit. Ephesians 4:4, there's only one Spirit. But the use of 7 indicates that this one Spirit is fully capable of doing what God wants done. This would be the idea in the number 7. 7 denotes the idea of completeness. All that's required, all that the situation would need. Okay, any comment on verse 5? We got about another 2 minutes. In verse 6, he says, and before the throne, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and round about the throne, 4 living creatures full of eyes before and behind. Now, so John's description here proceeds to the area that's surrounding the throne. Before the throne indicates, he says there's a sea of glass, clear as crystal. Now there's a couple of different interpretations of this. One is that this sea of glass represents God's, the separation that exists between God and all the other creation. That God is separate, but the sea being clear as crystal would indicate that even though he's separate from his creation, he's able to be seen exactly as he is. There's no distortion that would cause our view of him to be mistaken if we really look. Now that's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that this sea of glass represents God's transcendence, that he's so above us to the nth degree. It's incomprehensible just how much above us God is. Well, he tells us this in Isaiah 55. He says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Well, how much higher than the earth is the heavens? We don't know. It's infinite. Well, that's how much higher God's thoughts and ways are than our ways. It's infinite. There's no comparison. So I think this would probably represent that. The good thing about it in Revelation 21:1 is that in eternity there will be no more sea. So that means God's separation or his transcendence is not going to be there, whatever that would indicate. The sea's taken away. The sea is no more. And it's incomprehensible to how great and beautiful and wonderful and marvelous heaven is going to be. We just don't have any way of understanding it, much less conveying the thought of it. Any comment on verse 6? Well, there's a couple more thoughts there. The midst of the throne means it's closest to God. Full of eyes means that they're vigilant, watchful, and all-seeing. If there's no more comments, we'll close for this morning and pick up with verse 7 Wednesday night, Lord's willing. Thank you for your attention and participation in class.